They bit a life on my land. Big mistake.
The rain drummed against our kitchen windows like fingertips tapping out a funeral march, and I sat there at 3 a.m, nursing a whiskey that had gone warm an hour ago. Insomnia was my oldest friend these days, more reliable than my wife, more honest than my marriage, and a whole lot better company than the empty house that echoed with all the things Laura and I weren't saying to each other anymore. I heard her car pull into the driveway, that pretentious little BMW she'd bought herself for her birthday last month, the one that cost more than most people make in 6 months. The engine cut off, and I listened to her heels click-clack across the concrete like a countdown timer. 3:15 in the morning, and my loving wife was just getting home from another late night at the office. The front door opened with that particular squeak I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Laura's heels echoed through the hardwood hallway, each step a small lie wrapped in Italian leather. "Jason?" Her voice carried that fake surprise she'd perfected, like finding me awake was some kind of shocking coincidence. "What are you doing up?" I didn't turn around when she walked into the kitchen, just kept staring out at the rain, swirling my whiskey. Thought I'd wait up for my beautiful wife. Maybe fix her a welcome home martini. You know, like the good old days. She set her purse down on the granite countertop, the one I'd installed myself 3 years ago when we still pretended we were building something together. Her reflection in the window showed me everything I needed to know. Hair slightly mussed despite her attempts to fix it in the car. Lipstick gone. That particular glow that comes from doing things wives shouldn't be doing with men who aren't their husbands. "I was working late with the Henderson account," she said, opening the refrigerator like she actually planned to eat something. "You know how demanding those corporate restructures can be?" "Sure." I finally turned to look at her. Laura was 34, and still beautiful in that sharp, ambitious way that had attracted me 15 years ago. Back when I thought her drive was something we'd share instead of something she'd use to cut me down. Must be exhausting, all that restructuring. Her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a text message, and even from across the kitchen, I could see the name, Scotty. The message preview was short but educational. "Can't wait to feel you again tomorrow night." Laura lunged for the phone, but I was already reading. Amazing how much you can learn in 3 seconds when your world decides to collapse in real time. "So," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Scotty, that's an interesting name for the Henderson account." Her face went through several colors, pale, then red, then that particular shade of trap that guilty people wear when the walls close in. "Jason, I can explain." "I bet you can." I stood up, and Laura actually took a step back. Funny how 15 years of marriage can evaporate in the space between a husband and wife when the truth finally shows up to the party. But before you start explaining, let me ask you something. When exactly did you start sleeping with Scott Williams? The name hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish drowning in air. Because here's the thing, Laura. I've been doing some restructuring of my own. I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a manila folder I'd been saving for just this moment. Funny thing about being married to a woman in human resources, you learn to do your homework. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the counter. Property records mostly, mortgage transfers, a quitclaim deed with my signature on it, one I'd signed 6 months ago when Laura told me it was for tax purposes. "Turns out our house isn't our house anymore," I continued, watching her face go white. "According to these documents, which I'm sure you remember having me sign, our home now belongs to Scott Williams, luxury real estate agent and apparently my wife's new favorite restructuring project." Laura's composure cracked like ice under pressure. "Jason, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." I closed the folder and leaned against the counter, suddenly feeling very tired and very awake at the same time. "What I don't understand is why you thought I'd never figure it out. Did you really think I was that stupid? It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." My voice was getting harder now, 15 years of swallowed anger finally finding its way to the surface. "You've been screwing around with Scott Williams for God knows how long, and somewhere along the way, you two decided it would be fun to steal my house out from under me. How's that for restructuring?" Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Scotty. "Is the husband gone yet?" Laura grabbed the phone and clutched it against her chest like it might somehow protect her from what was happening. "You want to know what's really funny?" I asked, pouring myself another whiskey. "I actually respected you for working late all those nights. Thought you were building something for our family. Turns out you were just building something for yourself. Jason, please. Please what? Please pretend I didn't see the text messages. Please pretend our marriage isn't over. Please pretend my wife isn't a lying, cheating thief who's been planning to throw me out of my own house. The kitchen went quiet, except for the rain and the sound of Laura's breathing, which was coming fast and shallow like she'd been running. How long? I asked. What? How long have you been sleeping with him? She looked at the floor. 8 months. And how long have you been planning to steal my house? It's not stealing. The house was underwater on the mortgage. Scott helped us. Scott helped himself to my wife and my property. There's a difference. Laura's face hardened, and suddenly I was looking at a stranger. You want to know the truth, Jason? Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Scott. Yes, he bought the house. And yes, I want you out. Just like that? Just like that. She stood up straighter, and I could see the woman she'd been practicing to become in Scott's bed. Colder, meaner, more entitled. You have 48 hours to pack your things and get out. Scott is moving in this weekend. I nodded slowly, like I was considering this generous offer. 48 hours, that's very reasonable of you. I'm glad you're being mature about this. Oh, I'm being very mature. I finished my whiskey and set the glass down gently on the counter. In fact, I'm so mature that I'm going to give you some free advice. What's that? I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine emotion I'd experienced in months. Enjoy your new foundation, Laura. I really hope it holds up under pressure. She frowned, clearly not understanding, but I was already walking toward the back door. Where are you going? To get some air. And to make a few phone calls. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. You might want to call Scott. Tell him he's about to learn the difference between owning a house and owning the ground it sits on. I left her standing in the kitchen, staring after me with that confused, angry expression she wore whenever she realized she didn't know as much as she thought she did. Outside in the rain, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized 3 weeks ago, when I'd first started suspecting that my marriage was more than just troubled. Manny, it's Jason. I know it's late, but remember that conversation we had about foundations? Yeah, well, it's time to dig. Manny Gutierrez had been my right-hand man for 8 years, ever since I'd started Fairburn Construction. He was 52, built like a fire hydrant, and possessed the kind of street wisdom that comes from growing up poor and staying honest despite plenty of opportunities to do otherwise. More importantly, he was the only person I knew who could make me laugh when my world was falling apart. So, let me get this straight, Manny said, leaning against the workbench in my construction yard office. It was 6 a.m, and we were both running on coffee in righteous indignation. Your wife has been playing house with some real estate pretty boy and they think they can just kick you out of your own home? That's about the size of it. I spread the property documents across the workbench, pointing to the relevant sections. Look here. Scott Williams bought the house through a quick sale deed. Laura had me sign off on it 6 months ago, told me it was for tax restructuring. Manny squinted at the paperwork. But this here says the sale was contingent on existing land lease agreements. Exactly. I pulled out another document, this one from a different folder. And this is the land lease agreement I signed with the city 12 years ago when I first bought the property. The house sits on leased land and the lease is in my name only. So, pretty boy owns a house, but not the dirt it sits on. I grinned, and it felt good. Scott Williams just bought himself a very expensive mobile home. Manny started laughing, a deep belly laugh that shook his whole body. Jesus, Jason, your wife picked the wrong contractor to screw over. She sure did. I folded up the documents and put them back in the folder. But before I pull that particular rug out from under them, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. Think you can help me with some reconnaissance? What kind of reconnaissance? The legal kind. Dash cams, property surveillance, public records research. I want to know everything about Scott Williams, and I want to document every move Laura makes. Manny nodded slowly. You thinking about a custody fight? I'm thinking about a lot of things. I looked out the window at the construction yard, at the equipment and materials that represented 15 years of building something from nothing. But first, I want to understand exactly how deep this betrayal goes. We spent the morning setting up what Manny called the intelligence operation. 2 dash cams positioned to monitor the house from public streets, a subscription to a legal records database, a new cell phone with a recording app that would automatically save conversations to a cloud server. Now remember, Manny said as we tested the equipment. Everything we do has to be completely legal. No trespassing, no hacking, no breaking and entering. We're not criminals. Just concerned citizens documenting suspicious activity. Exactly. By noon, we had our surveillance network operational. I drove home to find Scott's silver Mercedes parked in my driveway like it belonged there. The sight of it made my chest tight with anger, but I kept my emotions in check. I had work to do. I parked across the street and called Laura's cell phone. "What do you want, Jason?" "Just letting you know I'll be by this afternoon to start packing. Wouldn't want to interrupt anything important." "Scott and I are discussing renovations. Can you make it after 6? "Renovations?" I laughed. "Sure, Laura. I'll be there at 6:30. I hung up and immediately called Attorney Green, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in property law and had helped me with several construction contract disputes over the years. "Jason, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I need to understand my options regarding a land lease violation." "What kind of violation?" I explained the situation, reading her the relevant sections from both the property sale and the land lease agreement. "Interesting," she said when I finished. "Your wife's boyfriend may have just bought himself a very expensive problem. The land lease clearly states that any structures on the property are subject to the leaseholder's approval. If you didn't approve the change in ownership," I definitely didn't approve it, "then Mr. Williams is in violation of the lease agreement, and you have grounds to terminate his occupancy. How long would that take?" "If the paperwork is as clear as you say, probably 30 days. Maybe less if we can prove fraud or coercion." "What about the house itself?" "That's where it gets interesting. He owns the structure, but if you terminate the land lease, he'll have to move it or sell it back to you at fair market value." I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in weeks. "And what's fair market value for a house with no land to sit on?" Attorney Green chuckled. "Significantly less than what he paid for it, I'd imagine." After I hung up, I sat in my truck for a long time, watching Scott's Mercedes gleam in my driveway. A plan was starting to form in my mind, something more elegant than simple revenge, something that would teach Laura and Scott that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the underdog knows more than the people trying to step on him. My phone rang. It was Diana Mays from the cycling club I'd joined 6 months ago, back when I was still trying to save my marriage by getting in shape and finding new interests. "Hey, Jason, we missed you at this morning's ride. Everything okay?" Diana was 36, a single mother with 2 kids and a smile that could light up a room. We'd become friends over long training rides and post-workout coffee, and she was one of the few people who knew about the problems in my marriage. Actually, no, Laura and I are getting divorced. "Oh, Jason, I'm so sorry. What happened?" "She's been having an affair with a real estate agent. They stole my house out from under me." "They what?" I gave her the abbreviated version, and by the end of it, Diana was furious on my behalf. "That's horrible. Where are you staying?" "I've got a couch in my office for now. It's not so bad." "Jason, you can't live in your office. Look, I've got a guest room. Why don't you stay here until you get things sorted out?" The offer caught me off guard. "Diana, I can't impose." "You're not imposing. You're a friend who needs help. Besides, my kids like you. Tommy's been asking when you're coming over to help him with his bike again." I felt something warm in my chest, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Kindness from someone who didn't want anything from me except friendship. "That's really generous of you. It's what friends do. Come by tonight after you're done at the house. We'll order pizza, and you can tell me all about your master plan." "What makes you think I have a master plan?" "Because you're Jason Fairburn. You don't just roll over when someone screws you. You figure out how to build something better." After we hung up, I realized Diana was right. I wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat quietly. I was a contractor, someone who solved problems by understanding how things were built and figuring out how to build them better. Laura and Scott thought they'd outmaneuvered me, but they'd made a fundamental error. They'd assumed I was just another victim, someone who would quietly accept being pushed around. They were about to learn that sometimes the foundation is more important than the house. I arrived at my former home at exactly 6:30, parking my pickup truck directly behind Scott's Mercedes. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Blue-collar honesty boxing and luxury pretension. I grabbed my toolbox from the truck bed, not because I needed tools, but because I wanted Scott to see exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Laura answered the door wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something expensive and clingy that screamed new relationship energy. Behind her, Scott Williams lounged in my living room like he owned the place, which technically he did. Scott was everything I'd expected and worse. Mid-30s, perfectly styled hair, the kind of tan that comes from golf courses and vacation homes. He wore a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments, and he had that particular brand of smugness that comes from believing your own sales pitch. "Jason," Laura said, her voice artificially bright. "Come in, Scott. This is my husband." "Ex-husband," Scott corrected, standing up and extending his hand like we were meeting at a cocktail party. "Scott Williams, I've heard so much about you." I looked at his manicured hand for a long moment, then walked past him without shaking it. "I'm sure you have." Scott's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I want you to know there are no hard feelings on my end. These things happen. Laura and I just connected. I set my toolbox down on the coffee table with more force than necessary. "That's an interesting way to put it." "Jason," Laura warned, "let's keep this civil." "Oh, I'm being very civil." I opened the toolbox and pulled out a measuring tape, mostly for effect. "I'm just here to pack my things and maybe take some measurements." "Measurements for what?" Scott asked. Professional curiosity. I extended the tape measure along the living room wall. "You know, as a contractor, I'm always interested in how structures hold up over time, especially when they're built on questionable foundations." Scott frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing at all." I retracted the tape measure with a sharp snap. Just making conversation. I spent the next hour packing my personal belongings while Laura and Scott whispered in the kitchen. I could hear fragments of their conversation, words like problem and lawyer and get rid of him. It was educational. When I finished packing, I found them sitting at the kitchen table, looking like they'd been planning something unpleasant. "All done," I announced. "I'll be out of your hair in just a minute." "Good," Scott said. "I'm sure you understand that we'd prefer if you didn't come by unannounced in the future." "Actually, that might be a problem." Both of them looked at me sharply. "See, I'll need to come by periodically to inspect the foundation and check on the utility connections." "What are you talking about?" Laura asked. I pulled out the land lease agreement and set it on the table. "Well, since I'm still the leaseholder for the land this house sits on, I have certain responsibilities. Regular inspections, maintenance oversight, that sort of thing." Scott grabbed the document and started reading, his face growing paler with each paragraph. "This can't be right," he said. "Oh, it's right." I pointed to the relevant section. "See, when you bought the house from Laura, you bought the structure, but the land it sits on is leased from the city, and that lease is in my name, has been for 12 years. Laura said the property was free and clear." I looked at my wife, ex-wife, and saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. "Laura says a lot of things," I replied. "But paperwork doesn't lie." Scott was reading faster now, his finger tracing the lines of legal text. "It says here that any change in property ownership requires approval from the leaseholder." "That's right." "And you didn't approve the sale?" "Nobody asked me to." The kitchen went very quiet. Laura was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means," I said, enjoying myself for the first time in months, "that Scott here is in violation of the land lease agreement, which means I can terminate his right to occupy the property." "You can't do that," Scott said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can. In fact, I'm required to. The lease agreement specifically states that unauthorized occupancy is grounds for immediate termination." I pulled out a second document, one I'd prepared that afternoon with Attorney Green's help. "This is a formal notice of lease violation," I continued. "You have 30 days to either get my written approval for your occupancy or remove the structure from the property." "Remove the structure?" Laura's voice was getting higher. "You can't make us move the house." "I'm not making you do anything, but if Scott wants to keep his investment, he'll need to either get my permission to stay or find somewhere else to put his house." Scott was on his feet now, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just what? Enforce a legal contract, protect my property rights?" I folded up the documents and put them back in my pocket. "Scott, you bought a house without doing your due diligence. That's not my problem." "How much?" he asked suddenly. "How much what?" "How much do you want?" To approve the occupancy? I pretended to consider this. Well, that's an interesting question. What's it worth to you? 10,000. To approve you living in a house with my wife? The wife you stole from me? I shook my head. That's not really about money, Scott. His face went from red to purple. Then what do you want? I want you to understand something. I stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet my eyes. You thought you were taking advantage of a dumb contractor who wouldn't know how to fight back. You thought you could steal my wife and my house, and I'd just roll over and take it. Jason, Laura started. But here's the thing, I continued, ignoring her. I've been building things for 20 years. I know how foundations work. And both of you built your little love nest on a foundation you didn't understand. I picked up my toolbox and headed for the door. Think about it, I called over my shoulder. You've got 30 days to figure out how to move a house or how to make me happy. Good luck with that. I left them sitting in the kitchen, staring at the lease violation notice like it might spontaneously combust. Outside, I loaded my belongings into the truck and took one last look at the house I'd called home for 8 years. Tomorrow, Scott and Laura would start making phone calls, trying to find a way out of the trap they'd built for themselves. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was going to sleep well. 3 weeks later, the 4th of July block party was in full swing, and I was watching my former life unfold from Diana's front porch 2 streets over. The irony wasn't lost on me. Celebrating independence while my ex-wife and her boyfriend were discovering just how dependent they'd become on my goodwill. Diana handed me a beer and settled into the porch swing beside me. Any word from the happy couple? Scott's lawyer called Attorney Green yesterday. They're offering $50,000 for my approval on the occupancy. That's a lot of money. It's not about the money. I took a long drink of beer and watched the fireworks exploding over the neighborhood where I used to live. It's about the principle. What principle is that? That actions have consequences. That you can't just take what belongs to someone else and expect them to smile about it. Diana was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What are you really going to do?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Larrabee, my former next-door neighbor in the neighborhood's unofficial intelligence network. "Jason, dear, you need to get over here right now." "What's wrong, Mrs. Larrabee?" "That awful man is making a scene at the block party. He's telling everyone you're trying to extort him, and Laura is backing him up. People are starting to believe them." I felt my jaw tighten. "What kind of scene?" "He's got a microphone from the DJ set up, and he's telling everyone about your lease situation. He's making you sound like the villain, dear. Like you're trying to steal their house out of spite." I looked at Diana, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. "We're on our way," I told Mrs. Larrabee. "Jason," Diana said as I hung up, "maybe you should let this go. Don't give them the satisfaction of getting under your skin." "They're not getting under my skin. They're making a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" I stood up and grabbed my keys. "They're fighting this battle in public, and there's nothing I like better than an audience when I'm right." The block party was exactly what you'd expect from a middle-class neighborhood trying to prove it still had community spirit. Red, white, and blue bunting everywhere. Kids running around with sparklers, adults drinking beer and pretending their marriages were happier than they actually were. I could hear Scott before I could see him. His voice carried over the crowd, smooth and confident like he was selling a house to potential buyers. "The truth is, Jason Fairburn is trying to use a legal technicality to steal our home. He's bitter about the divorce, and he's exploiting an outdated land lease agreement to punish Laura and me." I pushed through the crowd until I could see him standing on the makeshift stage next to the DJ booth. Laura was beside him, nodding along like a supportive political wife. About 30 neighbors were gathered around, listening with the kind of fascination people have for public drama. "The man is essentially holding us hostage," Scott continued. "He wants us to pay him $100,000 just for the privilege of living in a house we legally purchased." That was when I decided to join the conversation. "Actually," I called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I never asked for $100,000. The crowd turned to look at me, and I saw a mixture of expressions: curiosity, embarrassment, and, in a few cases, genuine interest. These were people who had known me for 8 years, who had hired me to build their decks and fix their plumbing. Scott's face went pale when he saw me, but he recovered quickly. "Jason, I didn't expect to see you here." "It's a public street, Scott. I'm allowed to be here." I walked closer to the stage, feeling the crowd's attention like a physical weight. But since you're discussing my business in public, maybe I should set the record straight. Jason, don't do this, Laura said, but her voice lacked conviction. Do what? Tell the truth? I looked around at the faces in the crowd, many of them familiar. See, folks, Scott here is right about one thing. I do own the land lease for the property his house sits on. What he's not telling you is how he came to own that house in the first place. That's irrelevant, Scott said. Is it? I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app I'd been using for 3 weeks. Because I've got some interesting conversations recorded. Legal recordings made with the consent of at least one party, me, just like the law allows. Scott's confidence wavered. What conversations? Well, there's the one where you and Laura discuss how you're going to get rid of the husband problem. And there's the really interesting one where you talk about forging my signature on the property transfer documents. The crowd was getting more interested now. Nothing draws an audience like the promise of scandal. I never forged anything, Scott said, but his voice was getting higher. No, then maybe you can explain why the signature on the quitclaim deed doesn't match the signature on the mortgage documents. I had a handwriting expert take a look. Very educational. Laura stepped forward. Jason, you're making a scene. I'm responding to a scene, Laura. There's a difference. I looked around at the crowd again. See, folks, here's what really happened. My wife was having an affair with Scott here, and they decided it would be fun to steal my house. They figured I was just a dumb contractor who wouldn't know how to fight back. That's not true, Scott said, but he was sweating now despite the evening breeze. Isn't it? Then why don't you tell everyone about the phone calls you've been making to my clients, trying to sabotage my business, or the fake online reviews you posted about my company? The crowd was murmuring now, and I could see the tide of public opinion shifting. These were working people who understood the value of honest labor and fair dealing. I never, Scott started. You never what? Never tried to destroy my livelihood after you stole my wife and my house? I pulled out another document, one I'd been saving for just this moment. This is a report from a private investigator documenting your harassment campaign. Dates, times, witnesses, all very legal and very thorough. Scott looked like he was about to be sick. What do you want from us? I want you to understand something. I stepped closer to the stage and my voice carried clearly over the crowd. You thought you were dealing with someone you could push around. You thought wrong. So, what happens now? Laura asked. And for the first time in months, she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger she'd become. I looked at her for a long moment, remembering 15 years of shared history, of dreams we'd built together before she decided to tear them down. Now you learn about consequences, I said. Both of you. I turned to address the crowd directly. Folks, I want you to know that everything I've done has been completely legal. I haven't broken any laws, haven't threatened anyone, haven't tried to hurt anyone. I've just enforced my property rights and documented the harassment I've received. What about our house? Scott asked desperately. What about it? We can't just move it. Sure you can. Houses get moved all the time. It's expensive, but it's doable. I smiled, and it felt like the most genuine emotion I'd experienced in months. Of course, you'll need to find somewhere to put it, and you'll need to pay for the move, and you'll need to make sure the new foundation meets building codes. That could cost more than the house is worth. It could, I nodded thoughtfully, or you could sell it to someone who wants to move it themselves, take whatever you can get, and cut your losses. You're destroying us, Laura said, and there were tears in her eyes. No, Laura, you destroyed us. I'm just making sure you understand what that means. I turned and walked away from the stage, leaving them standing there in front of 30 neighbors who now knew exactly what kind of people they were dealing with. Behind me, I could hear Scott trying to salvage the situation, but his voice was shaky and unconvincing. The crowd was already dispersing, people heading back to their own barbecues and fireworks with a story they'd be telling for years. Diana was waiting for me at the edge of the crowd, shaking her head with something that might have been admiration. Feel better? She asked. Actually, yes, I do. What happens next? I looked back at the stage, where Scott and Laura were having what appeared to be a heated argument in whispered voices. Now they figure out how to move a house, I said, or how to live with the consequences of their choices. And you? Me? I'm going to go home and sleep like a baby. For the first time in months, that was exactly the truth. The call came at 6 a.m, 2 weeks after the block party. It was Attorney Green, and she sounded like she'd been up all night. Jason, we need to talk. Scott Williams' lawyer just filed an emergency injunction to stop you from terminating the land lease. I sat up in Diana's guest bed, instantly awake. On what grounds? They're claiming the lease termination is retaliatory and that you're using it to extort money from them. Can they do that? They can try. We have a hearing this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Can you be there? Absolutely. After I hung up, I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. I'd expected Scott to fight back eventually, but I'd hoped he'd be smart enough to cut his losses and move on. Apparently, I'd overestimated his intelligence. Diana knocked on the door. Everything okay? I heard your phone. Scott's lawyer is trying to stop me from enforcing the lease agreement. Can he do that? We're about to find out. The courthouse was exactly what you'd expect from a mid-sized Texas city. All marble and brass, and the kind of intimidating architecture designed to make regular people feel small. I met Attorney Green in the hallway outside the courtroom, and she briefed me on what to expect. The judge is going to want to hear both sides, but the law is pretty clear. Property rights are property rights, and Scott violated the lease agreement. What's their argument? Basically that you're being vindictive, that the lease violation is just an excuse to get revenge on your ex-wife. And our response? That your personal feelings are irrelevant. Scott bought property without doing proper due diligence, and now he has to live with the consequences. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with maybe 20 seats for observers. Scott and Laura were already there with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s who looked like she ate property disputes for breakfast. Judge Martinez was a stern-looking man in his 60s who had the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter when he entered. This is an emergency hearing regarding the property at 1247 Maple Street, he began. Mr. Williams is seeking an injunction to prevent Mr. Fairburn from terminating a land lease agreement. Miss Patterson, you may proceed. Scott's lawyer stood up and launched into a presentation that painted me as a vindictive ex-husband using legal technicalities to harass innocent people. Your Honor, Mr. Fairburn is clearly misusing the legal system to get revenge on his ex-wife and her new partner. The land lease in question has been dormant for over a decade, and Mr. Fairburn never raised any objections until after he discovered his wife's relationship with Mr. Williams. She went on for 10 minutes, describing me as everything short of a terrorist. When she finished, Judge Martinez turned to Attorney Green. Miss Green, your response? Your Honor, this case is very simple. Mr. Williams purchased a house that sits on leased land. The lease agreement clearly states that any change in occupancy requires the approval of the leaseholder. Mr. Williams never sought this approval, placing him in violation of the lease terms. But surely, Judge Martinez said, the timing of Mr. Fairburn's enforcement action is relevant? With respect, Your Honor, the timing is irrelevant. Property rights don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. If Mr. Williams had done proper due diligence before purchasing the property, he would have discovered the lease requirement. Judge Martinez looked at the documents for a long moment, then addressed Scott directly. Mr. Williams, did you know about the land lease when you purchased the property? Scott stood up, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, I was told by Miss Fairburn that the property was free and clear. Did you conduct a title search? My real estate agent handled that. And what did the title search reveal? Scott's lawyer whispered something in his ear and his face went pale. Your Honor, the title search did mention the land lease, but we were told it was inactive. Who told you it was inactive? Miss Fairburn. Judge Martinez turned to Laura. Miss Fairburn, did you tell Mr. Williams the land lease was inactive? Laura stood up slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I thought it was just a formality. Did you read the lease agreement? Not carefully. Judge Martinez looked back at the documents, and I could see him making the same connections I'd made months earlier. Miss Patterson, he said to Scott's lawyer, your client purchased property based on incorrect information from the seller without conducting proper due diligence. How is this Mr. Fairburn's problem? Your Honor, we believe Mr. Fairburn is acting in bad faith. Bad faith? Judge Martinez interrupted. Mr. Fairburn is enforcing a legal contract. The fact that your client doesn't like the terms of that contract doesn't make it bad faith. He looked around the courtroom, his gaze settling on me. Mr. Fairburn, do you have any intention of allowing Mr. Williams to remain on the property? I stood up. Your Honor, I'm willing to consider it. Under what terms? Mr. Williams would need to acknowledge that he violated the lease agreement and pay appropriate damages for the unauthorized occupancy. How much in damages? I looked at Scott, who was staring at me like I held his life in my hands. Fair market rent for the land, retroactive to the date of purchase. That would be about 18 months at $500 per month. $9,000. Scott's lawyer started to object, but Judge Martinez held up his hand. That seems reasonable. Mr. Williams, are you prepared to pay $9,000 in damages and ongoing rent for the land lease? Scott looked at his lawyer, who shrugged helplessly. Your Honor, we need time to consider. You have until 5 o'clock today, Judge Martinez said. If you don't agree to Mr. Fairbairn's terms by then, the lease termination stands, and you have 30 days to remove the structure from the property. He banged his gavel, and suddenly it was over. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Scott and Laura huddled with their lawyer, while Attorney Green and I reviewed what had just happened. That went better than expected, she said. Think they'll take the deal? They'd be crazy not to. $9,000 is a lot less than the cost of moving a house. But as I watched Scott and Laura arguing in whispers, I realized they might be exactly that crazy. At 4:30, Attorney Green called me. They rejected the offer. What? Scott Williams just called. He said he'd rather move the house than pay you a dime. I sat back in my office chair, genuinely surprised. He's going to spend $50,000 moving a house to avoid paying $9,000 in damages? Apparently so. Then I guess we'll see how committed he is to that decision. Jason, are you sure you want to do this? Once that house is gone, there's no going back. I looked out the window at my construction yard, at the equipment and materials that represented everything I'd built from nothing. Some foundations are worth protecting, I said, and some aren't worth saving. The next morning, I drove by the house to see a moving company truck parked in the driveway and Scott directing workers who were preparing to jack up the structure. I rolled down my window and called out to him. You sure about this, Scott? He looked at me with pure hatred. Go to heck, Jason. Fair enough. Just remember, you chose this. As I drove away, I realized that Scott Williams had just taught me something important about the difference between winning and being right. Sometimes being right was better than winning. 3 months later, I was standing in my new office, looking out at the construction yard that had doubled in size since the divorce was finalized. Losing the house had been painful, but losing the marriage had been liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Diana knocked on the door and walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and a newspaper. You need to see this, she said, handing me the local section. The headline read, Local real estate agent files for bankruptcy after house moving disaster. The article was everything I could have hoped for. Scott Williams had spent $65,000 moving the house to a lot across town, only to discover that the new foundation didn't meet current building codes. The city had condemned the structure, and Scott was facing another $40,000 in renovation costs to make it habitable. It gets better, Diana said. Keep reading. The article went on to detail how Scott's real estate business had collapsed after several clients sued him for failing to disclose property issues. Apparently, my situation hadn't been an isolated incident. Scott had been cutting corners on due diligence for years. And Laura? I asked. 3rd paragraph. I found the relevant section. Laura had been fired from her HR position after the company discovered she'd been using her access to employee records to help Scott target potential clients. She was currently working as a receptionist at a dental office. Karma's a witch, Diana observed. No, I said, folding up the newspaper. Karma is just the natural consequence of poor decision-making. My phone rang. It was Mrs. Larrabee. Jason, dear, you'll never guess what just happened. What's that, Mrs. Larrabee? A young couple just bought the lot where your house used to be. They're looking for a contractor to build them a new home. I gave them your number. I looked out the window at the empty lot across town where Scott and Laura's house now sat, crooked on its inadequate foundation. Thanks, Mrs. Larrabee. I'll give them a call. After I hung up, Diana asked, Are you going to take the job? Probably. It's a good lot, nice neighborhood, the kind of place where people build things to last. And it doesn't bother you? Building on the same spot where your marriage fell apart? I thought about that for a moment. Do you know what the most important thing is when you're building a house? What's that? The foundation. Everything else, the walls, the roof, the fancy finishes, none of that matters if the foundation isn't solid. And my marriage had a weak foundation. It was built on assumptions and compromises and the hope that problems would fix themselves if we just ignored them long enough. I walked over to the window and looked out at the construction equipment, at the materials and tools that represented 20 years of building things the right way. But this, I continued, gesturing at the yard, this is built on something solid, hard work, honest dealing, the understanding that if you want something to last, you have to build it right from the ground up. Diana joined me at the window. So, what happens now? Now, I build something better. 6 months later, I was standing in the finished kitchen of the new house on Maple Street, watching the young couple who'd hired me walk through their new home for the first time. They were holding hands and talking excitedly about their plans for the future, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in work well done. The house was everything my old home hadn't been, built on a solid foundation, constructed to last, designed by people who understood the difference between a structure and a home. As I packed up my tools, I got a text message from an unknown number. Jason, this is Laura. I heard about the new house. It looks beautiful. I wanted you to know I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you can forgive me someday. I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Some foundations, once cracked, can't be repaired. The only solution is to tear them down and build something new. Outside, Diana was waiting in her car to drive me home. Home to the house we'd bought together 6 months earlier. The one we'd designed from the ground up with a foundation strong enough to last a lifetime. How'd it go? She asked as I got in the car. Perfect. They love it. And how do you feel? I looked back at the house one more time, at the solid structure rising from the carefully prepared foundation, like I finally built something worth keeping. As we drove away, I realized that Scott and Laura had done me a favor, though they'd never intended to. They'd forced me to tear down something that was built on weak ground and start over with better materials. The foundation they'd tried to steal had never really been mine to begin with. It was built on compromises and assumptions and the hope that love would be enough to hold everything together. But the foundation I'd built since then, that was mine. Built on honesty and hard work and the understanding that some things are worth fighting for and some things are worth walking away from. 3 years later, I was standing in another kitchen, this one in the house Diana and I had designed together. Our house, built on our land, with a foundation that would outlast both of us. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a process server holding an envelope. Jason Fairburn, that's me. You're being sued by Scott Williams for intentional infliction of emotional distress and interference with business relationships. I took the envelope and signed for it, then closed the door and walked back to the kitchen where Diana was making dinner. Who was that? She asked. Scott Williams is suing me. She looked up from the stove. For what? I opened the envelope and read the complaint. He says I ruined his life by enforcing the land lease agreement. Are you worried? I looked at the lawsuit, then at the kitchen we'd built together, then at the woman who'd helped me understand the difference between a house and a home. No, I said, tossing the papers in the trash. I'm not worried at all. Why not? Because some foundations are strong enough to withstand any storm. 6 months later, Scott's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. The judge ruled that enforcing a legal contract couldn't constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress, no matter how much the other party disliked the consequences. Scott Williams disappeared from town shortly after that, reportedly moving to another state to start over. Laura stayed, working her receptionist job and living in a small apartment across town. I never saw either of them again. But sometimes, when I'm working on a new construction project, I think about the lesson they taught me, that the most important part of any structure isn't what you can see from the street. It's what's buried underneath, holding everything else up, and that when someone tries to steal your foundation, sometimes the best response is to build a better one.